At the time of the vernal equinox, in the material world, a wonderful, vibrant energy and new life quickening is observed everywhere in the vegetable kingdom. The animal kingdom and human kingdoms are resuscitated and move forward with the new impulse. The whole world is born anew, resurrected. Gentle zephyrs are set in motion, wafting and fragrant. Flowers bloom, the trees are in blossom, the air temperate and delightful. How pleasant and beautiful become the mountains, fields, and meadows. Likewise, the spiritual bounty and springtime of God quicken the world of humanity with the new animus and vivification. All the virtues which have been deposited and potential in human hearts are being revealed from that reality as flowers and blossoms from divine gardens. It is a day of joy, a time of happiness, a period of spiritual growth. I beg of God that this divine spiritual civilization may have the fullest impression and effect upon you. May you become as growing plants. May the trees of your hearts bring forth new leaves and variegated blossoms. May ideal fruits appear from them in order that the world of humanity, which has grown and developed in material civilization, may be quickened in the bringing forth of spiritual ideals. Abdul Baha.
Thank you. So now I'll introduce our speaker for today. Today, we're so excited to have Mr. Tom Lysaght back with us, and his topic is The Baha'i Calendar, Putting Eternity Back in Time. Raised Irish Catholic in Brooklyn, Mr. Tom Lysaght graduated from Harvard University and has written some 30 plays in both English and Spanish, published by Samuel French, and produced from villages in the Andes to Off-Broadway. Lysaght was founding director and resident playwright of El Teatro de Pan y Paz, Bread and Peace Theater, in rural Peru, where he wrote circus drama plays about social, economic, and health challenges, utilizing masks, stilts, and 15-foot-high puppets for open-air performances in the Andean villages. In Peru, he also served as manager of Radio Baha'i of Lake Titicaca. A member of the Dramatists Guild, Lysaght has received numerous writing fellowships, including from the MacDowell Colony, the Edward Albee Foundation, and the Israeli Center for the Arts. His prose has been published by One Voice Press, George Ronald Limited, and Calumet Press, while his poetry has appeared in New Canadian Review and Tokens Magazine. A resident of Los Angeles, Lysaght taught literature and writing at Brentwood School for 20 years. And he also has a book out called Persian Passion, which is a dramatic and historically accurate account of the beginnings of the Baha'i Faith. And this book is available on Baha'i bookstores and Amazon. And with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. Lysaght.
Well, Happy New Year. And I'm saying that because few of us know that for almost 2,000 years, March 20th was the new year in the Western world. Until 1582, March 20 and 21st, the spring equinox, was the first day of the year. And we'll talk a little bit about how that changed. But first, let me start with a caveat that I'm not quite an expert on astronomy or on calendars. And if you really want to know the story of the Badi or Baha'i calendar, Dr. Nadir Saidi is truly the expert, and many of my ideas come from him. So almost 2,000 years ago, I said, this was the new year. And it makes sense because, especially if you're living in the colder climes, you feel at this time of year that tug of war between the cooler and the colder and the warmer days. And it really then helps us to understand that there is this light overcoming darkness on this day. In other words, the nights have been longer until March 20th, but on March 20th, we get that equilibrium of the 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness. And of course, beginning tomorrow, the light begins to overcome more and more the darkness. So it truly is a time of new beginnings, and we can understand why so many cultures have this day as the new year. But let me first just sort of give a little bit of an overview of why we even have calendars. And the fact of the matter is that we all exist in historical time. I mean, think of your own personal life, your birthday, and how that's sort of a focal point, perhaps anniversaries in your life. Even in the womb, we speak of the trimester. So time is everywhere in terms of our identity. It's an essential part of forming our identity. And in many ways, it's really, our identity is inseparable from time. We measure so many things about ourselves that way. And really the past also comes alive through the calendar. It still remains with us in being able to block out and measure those times. So where do we stand in time has always been a question facing humanity. So historically, the most common way of measuring time was by the moon, because the moon and the menstrual cycles were natural time divisions for measurement. And so, for example, if you study Native American culture, you read about these very colorful names of the months of the year. Incidentally, in many languages, the word for moon and month is the same word. In the Native American various cultures, you hear the falling leaves moon month, the buffalo dropping calves month, the corn maker month, the red berries month. This naming of the months in terms of the natural processes. But of course, this mainly reflected the hunter-gatherer societies. But once agriculture became a stabilizing influence in human civilization, the lunar calendar proved inadequate because sowing and harvesting times happen during certain times. And so one must know the appropriate season of each year. You must have these reference points. And so we know historically, for example, that our calendar, we can trace it back to Egypt because the Nile and agriculture was so important to the Egyptians that they developed a solar calendar based on the sun, of course. And this was such an exact and helpful calendar that when Julius Caesar came to Egypt, besides his relationships with Cleopatra, he also took back to Rome the Egyptian calendar because it was so precise. And previously, the Roman calendar had only 10 months, and we can tell that from the names of some of our months. So September, for example, which is now the 9th month, in Roman times was the 7th month, because septem in Latin, like siete in Spanish, means 7. October was the 8th month. Octubre, you say, or ocho in Spanish for 8, etc. So Julius Caesar, borrowing from the Egyptians, added 2 months because a 12-month calendar seemed better. And of course, the 2 new months he named for him July, and for his successor, Augustus Caesar, August. And so this particular calendar, called the Julian calendar, continued in Europe until 1582. And at that point, it was realized that every year, 11 minutes were being lost, because it's very difficult, as you know, the lunar calendar, a new moon is every 29 days. And so it's very difficult to have exact calculations of dividing the year into 12, let's say. And so 11 minutes were being lost. So Pope Gregory XIII came up with a new calendar, which now we call the Gregorian calendar after his name. And this particular calendar changed the new year from March 21st to January 1st. And of course, January 1st really has no importance, certainly agriculturally or spiritually, as we'll see. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But one thing that's often overlooked when we talk about the Gregorian calendar is where Pope Gregory got his influence. And his influence came from the Aztecs and the Mayans, because when the conquistadors came to the New World, they discovered, interestingly enough, that the Mayans and the Aztecs had solar calendars, and they were much more accurate than the European Julian calendar. In fact, the Mayan and the Aztec calendar is going to sound very familiar to Baha'is because their year was composed of 18 months with 20 days, with 5 days left over, which they called nameless days. And we'll see in a second when we talk about the Baha'i or Bahá'í calendar, how it's most similar to the Aztec and the Mayan calendars. But the importance of a solar calendar is such that we even see that when the Islamic Revolution took place in the 1970s and the Islamic Republic turned back the clock on so many things, on women's rights, on tolerance of other religions, one thing they did not change, interestingly, was the Muslim lunar calendar. Iran kept the solar calendar. And this shows really how important and how powerful and how precise the solar calendar is. Islam, of course, having come out of the desert, it wasn't an agricultural society. And so the lunar calendar was more fitting at that time. So let me just transition here as to saying, one of the biggest questions for any calendar is then, well, when do we begin? What will be the first day? As we just discussed, today being the first day of the Baha'i year, and for much of history, it was the new year. So usually it's a significant event. So for example, the formation of the French Republic after the French Revolution, they started the new calendar, believe it or not. And of course, the first day was the Bastille Day, but that calendar only lasted 10 years. So it's more instructive if we look at some of the religious calendars and see what day they choose to begin their year. And we see, for example, that in Christianity, the Christian calendar, which we call the Gregorian calendar, it begins with the birth of Christ. The Islamic calendar, it also begins with an event in the messenger of God's life. And this was Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina, commonly referred to as the Hijra or Hijra. Now, what's interesting is that the Baha'i calendar does not begin with an action or an event by the messenger of God, but in accordance with the maturity of the age, it begins with a response to the revelation. So the Bahá'í calendar, Bahá'í incidentally means new or wonderful. The Bahá'í calendar begins with Mullah Hussein's recognition of the Bab as a messenger of God on May 23rd, 1844. So this is much more significant than we sometimes realize, because it's indicating that in this day and age, and we'll talk about this in a second, and how the Bahá'í calendar reminds us of this, is that in this day and age, for the first time, despite the fact that the book of Genesis tells us that we were made in the image and likeness of God, this is the first day in which humanity is capable of reflecting completely the attributes of God and truly becoming in his image and likeness. And so this response, this recognition of the messenger of God is indicative of a response being called from us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But as to the specifics of the Baha'i or the Bahá'í calendar, it's divided into 19 months of 19 days. And 19, the word, and there are two words in Persian and Arabic, Wahid and Wahid. One is a name and one means unity. And the one meaning unity is the one I'm referring to here. So forgive me, those who speak Persian and Arabic, if I'm mispronouncing the proper pronunciation of Wahid, but it means unity. And in the numerical way in which many languages add up letters numerically, Wahid equals 19. So 19 becomes the symbol of unity in the Baha'i dispensation and in the Baha'i calendar. So not only is the calendar 19 months of 19 days, but each day and each month is named for an attribute of God. So it's this sense of inhabiting the attributes of God. Instead of simply naming the months after letters like Septem and Octubre, the way the Romans did, or naming the days of the week after gods like Thor for Thursday, we now have the names and attributes of God infusing time. And the 5 days, like the nameless days of the Aztec and the Mayan calendar, the 5 days of that Baha'is refer to as the days of Ha or Yamaha is also, in a sense, nameless days because they stand for the unknowable, nameless essence of God. In other words, Ha, or the letter Ha, is often seen to be symbolic of the expression He is God. So it's the sense of these 5 days of God, these that are off the calendar time, so to speak, that are invisible days, spiritual days. And of course, for Baha'is, there are times of gift giving, of visiting the sick and the poor, of celebration. And we can see how this is reflected in the Gregorian calendar that has a Lenten observance, like the Baha'is have a fast period. And previous to the Lenten observance, there's often celebrated Mardi Gras. And of course, Mardi is French for Tuesday, because Lent begins on Ash Wednesday. So Mardi Gras is also this celebratory time before the fasting of Lent. And of course, in Latin America, Carnival is that same celebration of Mardi Gras. And Carnival, of course, coming from the word for flesh or body, it's this celebration of our physical essence before we begin identifying during Lent, and as Baha'is do during fast, with our true reality, which is our spiritual reality. So these days of Ha, beginning as they do, let me just interject here that the Ba'diya Baha'i calendar was inaugurated by the Bab, but Baha'u'llah added 2 elements to it. The Bab hadn't said where these 5 nameless days would be placed, and it was Baha'u'llah who said, we'll put them before the last month of the year, the month of fasting. So with that, we begin to have this dialectical nature established, as I just tried to explain, between the body and the soul, so to speak, and this notion of celebration, and then this sense of retreat and reflection upon our true essential spiritual nature, followed, of course, by the coming of spring and new beginnings, new blossomings from this period of fasting and reflection. So it's a spiritual journey, the Ba'diya calendar. It symbolizes time as a spiritual journey, and it is a solar calendar. However, many calendars are a combination of solar and lunar, and there are 2 elements, as I say, Baha'u'llah added, and one was the placement of the 5 days of God, and the other was where the twin holy days of the manifestations would be celebrated. Because of this emphasis on unity with this calendar and with this new dispensation, Baha'u'llah wanted to emphasize the reality that all the manifestations of God are one. Now, on the lunar Muslim calendar, the first day and the first month is Muharram. The Bab was born on the 1st of Muharram, and Baha'u'llah was born on the 2nd of Muharram, in different years, but on the same day of the same month. And so in order to keep this as symbolic of the unity of the Bab and Baha'u'llah and of all manifestations, Baha'u'llah wanted there to be this twin celebration of the birth dates. And so the way the time for celebrating the twin birthdays is determined is a lunar calculation. And this was ingeniously derived by the Universal House of Justice, namely the 8th time the moon appears after Nowruz, after today, then the birthdays occur. And that's why we see that they will sometimes float on the Gregorian calendar when we celebrate them. So once again, the twin manifestations birthdays symbolize the unity of all manifestations and this emphasis on unity with the Bahá'í calendar. So as I say, the Bahá'í calendar is not mathematically, but astronomically calculated. Its reference point is nature. And so over the course of the year, one becomes more intimate with the natural world, as we are today, as light overcomes darkness. By the same token, the Baha'i day begins at sunrise and it ends at sunset. Once again, there is nothing happening in nature at midnight for the day to begin then. But when the forces of creation are stirring at dawn, and when they're quieting as we see the birds roosting at sunset, we begin to be more in touch with this sense of nature, with this calendar. But why did we need a new calendar? Well, it's because there's a new identity today, as I mentioned. It's the first time in history that humanity can reflect fully the attributes and qualities, if you will, of God. And by that, I mean things like honesty, justice, trustworthiness, chastity, truthfulness, generosity. And so we need a new identity for this new day. So as I said, it regulates our relationship to nature. We become clearer how we're part of nature. We therefore become custodians of nature and seek the sustainability of nature. But it also lends us an identity as a world community. So we're not just in historical time, but we're in global consciousness. It's one calendar for one world, a unifying calendar. And we're all unified by the attributes of God that we're all seeking to reflect. So it gives us a spiritual consciousness. You know, until now, when I say now in this era, humanity has defined himself and others in terms of separation. We clung to our differences. We did not want to be in the image and likeness of God. Because if you think of the image and likeness of God, think of the sun as it shines everywhere. It gives light to every place, everywhere, regardless of injustice in those places or justice. And so the sun shines everywhere. And the rays of the sun don't gather into little identity groups. The rays of the sun are actually equal to the sun. So that when we're lying on the beach, we don't say that we're lying in the rays. We say we're lying in the sun because the rays have become identified with the sun. And until this time in spiritual evolution, humanity has not wanted to be united. It has clung to separation. It's clung to tribalism. It's clung to racialism, to nationalism, to all these ways of differing. Even religions define themselves in terms of separation. And perhaps if your mother wasn't of that religion, you couldn't be. Religion was so based on tradition. However, the Bahá'í calendar, which symbolizes the one unity, the Vahid of this day, is instead of identifying us as the mirror reflecting the sun. Now, interestingly enough, remember, the moon reflects the sun. So the lunar calendar is indicative of this old world way of thinking, identifying with the moon, with the mirror, as opposed to identifying with the sun shining in the mirror. So today, when we see this regression to tribalism in the modern world, we see this clinging to identity groups, this identifying with the mirror. Now, in the Baha'i faith, we identify ourselves with the sun, that each of us has a distinct mirror, a distinct diversity, which we celebrate, whether it's racial or gender or ethnicity or linguistic, and we celebrate that diversity. But we don't mistakenly identify ourselves as the mirror. We identify ourselves with the common unifying attributes of God that we're all polishing our mirror to reflect. So we're all different mirrors. That's our diversity, which we celebrate. But we're no longer defining ourselves by that division, but by the reality of our unity. We're focused on the sun, which brings us back to this first day of the year in which the sun, the light, is overcoming the darkness. And so even though we want to appreciate our diversity and certainly not regress into former times when people felt the need to assimilate or to hide the uniqueness of their culture, we want to celebrate this. But instead of celebrating my truth as a certain race or gender or nation, we want to celebrate the truth of the Godhead within us all. So time has become spiritualized, making us conscious of our true reality. And as we begin to recall the names of the day, and I bet very few of us know what the name of today is, Saturday. By the way, Saturday is the first day of the week of the Baha'i calendar. But today is a very, very special day in the Baha'i calendar because it's the day of Baha on the month of Baha. So it's a very, very powerful day and very, very indicative of how the light is overcoming the darkness. In fact, Abdu'l-Baha says that the equinox is a symbol of the manifestation of God, that the manifestation or the messenger of God dawns on the horizon, infusing light. And so we're being asked to do what Mullah Hussein did, to respond to this dawn, to respond to this light, and to reflect it. So the question is, how will each one of us respond to the revelation, that's this new potentiality that's been released for the first time, that we can reflect all those attributes of God? And so then that's the question I sort of leave with us. How can we begin to inhabit the calendar, to know the names of the days of the week, the names of the month, and not simply know them the way we were mistakenly taught history in former times by simply memorizing dates, but to begin to inhabit the day of justice, the day of grace, the day of glory, and to really celebrate today as a new year. In one of the tablets of the Bab that hasn't been translated into English yet, just as the calendar spiritualizes time, our purpose as human beings is to spiritualize space. And so the Bab tells us in one of his tablets, the reason why we go to work, the reason why you have a job, is in order to infuse matter with spirit, that you go to your job in order to bring these attributes of God, to bring fairness, to bring generosity, to bring justice. So our role in responding, in reflecting this light, is to spiritualize space in the same way that Baha'u'llah in the Bab has spiritualized time. And so I'll conclude by saying Happy New Year and reading a quote from Baha'u'llah's most holy book, the Aqdas, about the significance of today, March 20th. Baha'u'llah says, "Happy the one who entereth upon the first day of the month of Baha, the day which God hath consecrated to this great name. This day is the crown of all the months, and the day on which the breath of life is wafted over all created things. Great is the blessedness of him who greeteth it with radiance and joy." Happy New Year.
Thank you, Mr. Lysaght, for those informative and also inspirational words. And it really helps put into perspective the potency of today, even though I still think none of us can really grasp how important this day is, but it helps us to start thinking about it. Now we have time for questions and answers, so you can put your questions in the chat and I will read them. Okay, our first question is from Armin. How did you become a Baha'i?
Well, I went on a quest seeking God. So I went to the South Pacific. I wanted to go as far away as possible. I was 22. And after 4 months, of seeking, I encountered the writings of Baha'u'llah, became a Baha'i that week. That's the short version.
Wow.
I was raised Roman Catholic, became an agnostic in high school, an atheist in college, and then had a personal experience in which I realized there was a creative force. And so I went on that quest to learn how to connect with it, because I realized I couldn't just wait for lightning to strike. Now that I knew that there was electricity in the wall, I wanted to know how to plug into it on a regular basis. And I was blessed by encountering the teachings of Baha'u'llah.
It's interesting. Thank you. So Lena asks, you have a Roman Catholic background. So does your family accept, your Baha'i beliefs?
Well, as I said, I was 22 when I became a Baha'i. My mother was very unhappy with it. No one else really showed any interest. Many years later, one of my nephews became a Baha'i, but other than that, I'm the only Baha'i in my biological family.
Alex asks, what do you consider the difference between the virtues as we know them, such as justice, love, patience, and the divine virtues in the form of the Word of God?
Is that a written question, or
Yes.
I'd like the person maybe to try to elaborate? I want to make sure I understand the question.
Okay. Yeah, Alex.
Or perhaps read it again if he or she doesn't want to speak aloud.
Okay, so it's basically saying, what is the difference between the virtues as we know them versus the divine virtues in the form of the Word of God?
Well, I think you answered that question when you began the question and answer by saying we don't even really quite understand, even though we can have an intellectual understanding of the calendar, we still don't quite grasp how do we inhabit the attributes of God. And so just as we all have different and false concepts of the Godhead, of the creative force, I'm sure we all have different ideas of the attributes of God, and certainly whatever idea we have of those attributes, they're also erroneous because God is beyond our understanding, which isn't to say that we shouldn't seek to reflect them, but I don't know that we'll ever be able to encompass a true and full understanding of those attributes. Certainly we see how the world is greatly struggling, and how the world in many ways mistakenly rewards the opposite of the attributes of God. You can more quickly get your picture on the cover of a magazine, I think, sometimes, if you don't follow the virtues. I don't know if I'm answering the question or not.
Thank you. Yeah, Alex, if you had any more thoughts, you can add it in the chat. Okay, so Manu here asks, could you please repeat what made the Western countries change the celebration of the New Year from March to January 1st?
I can't specifically say why Pope Gregory XIII changed the New Year, because, logically, it would seem to make sense that he should have kept it, since one of the reasons for recalibrating the calendar was because Easter is a movable feast, and they needed to determine every year when Easter would be. And because Easter, like Rizwan, and Nowruz, is a celebration of resurrection, of the light resurrecting out of the darkness, it would logically seem to me that he would have kept it at March 21st. As to why he changed it to January 1st, I don't know, unless he was going back to the Roman, Janus, the Roman god, has a double face, facing forward and facing backwards. So that was why the Romans had January as the first month, looking back at the old year and looking forward. But I'm just guessing out loud as an answer. As I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert on calendars.
Thank you. Armin asks, what are the names of the days of the Baha'i week? And can you tell us a little more about them?
Well, you can Google it. It's actually on Google. I know some of them. Grace, justice, glory. they're not all identical. Some of them repeat names of the months and some don't. So the first 2 days of the week are Jalal and Jamal, for example. But it's worth looking into. So I'll leave that to your own investigative.
Okay, thank you. Lena asks, could you elaborate on your understanding of Baha'i justice? Everyone seems to have different interpretations.
Well, I think the best way is to look at the second hidden word that Baha'u'llah wrote, O Son of Justice, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Who knows it by heart? Who can repeat the rest of the hidden word?
Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not that I may confide in thee. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Verily justice is my gift to thee, and a sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes.
And wouldn't that be amazing if all lawyers like her knew that by heart? Well, well, a couple of things we see there, Baha'u'llah is telling us, that we have to judge with our own eyes. So that throws tradition out the window, doesn't it? That we have to see with our own eyes. And tradition is one of the biggest obstacles to truth. And look how so many people are bound religiously to tradition as opposed to religious experience and religious practice. So to see with our own eyes, number one, and not only to go by precedents. It also, interestingly enough, emphasizes the heart as the discerning organ. What is the line about the heart towards the end, please?
Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be.
So that's also reminding us that our heart is our master and our mind is the servant. And so it's with our accepting and our loving and embracing heart that we come to, I think, know and understand. And in fact, in Baha'u'llah's Book of Certitude, he repeatedly says 17 times, ponder in thy heart. It sounds counterintuitive. One would think you would ponder in your mind, but there's something limiting about the judgmental mind as opposed to the embracing, accepting heart. So I think justice is very much related. And that's probably why Abdul Baha tells us that women will be the cause of world peace, because they have more susceptible hearts, he tells us. And in the future, women will think it's utterly ludicrous to send their sons off to war.
Thank you. Okay, so Alex has elaborated a little bit. He said, thank you for that answer. So the word of God and his virtues are said to be above any attributes, while the virtues as we know them are associated with this world or the contingent world. So how do we speak about divine virtues in relation to the virtues that we can identify with?
Well, I would think it's once again humbling, realizing that our goal is to polish that mirror to reflect these attributes. But we never will be able to perfectly reflect justice, generosity, chastity, truthfulness. But that shouldn't stop us. Just like nearness to God, in one of the most famous, Christian prayers, it says that Jesus sits at the right hand of God, so that we see that even the manifestation of God is not totally complete. We have these passages where Baha'u'llah speaks with the voice of the Ancient of Days, but at other times he speaks with the voice of the manifestation. Certainly, he's not schizophrenic. Certainly he's never separate, but yet there is something about that divine Godhead that is above and beyond even the manifestation of God. So certainly we will never know. Just like bisecting an angle, you can keep getting closer and closer, but you're never going to get totally at one with that. And so I think in that sense, our goal is to do our best to reflect these on this earthly plane, realizing that ultimately those attributes of God are sanctified above this plane.
Thank you. That makes sense. Arman has a comment and question. So he says, in my study of calendars, religion, I've noticed that perhaps another reason why every divine revelation has also brought a new calendar is due to God wanting to anchor human minds closer to the present moment. In some religious communities, one of the attributes of God is the ever-present, and perhaps humans now have an opportunity globally to detach their minds from the illusion of time, past, and future mental attachments. Do you have any insights on the importance of being present and how it relates to living a spiritual life, or any general thoughts around this? And he says, a segment from a Baha'i prayer written by Baha'u'llah on spiritual growth reads, before the revelations of thine invisible spirit, summon me to be present, O thou who art my origin and my highest wish.
I think everybody could probably value from hearing that all again, but I certainly could begin to speak. Do you think we should have that repeated so everyone can hear it a second time? Or
Sure, yeah, I'll read that again. So in his study of calendars and religion, etc., he's noticed that perhaps another reason why every divine revelation has also brought a new calendar is due to God wanting to anchor human minds closer to the present moment. In some religious communities, one of the attributes of God is the ever-present, and perhaps humans now have an opportunity globally to detach their minds from the illusion of time, past and future mental attachments. Do you have any insights on the importance of being present and how it relates to living a spiritual life, or any general thoughts around this? And the prayer by Baha'u'llah reads, before the revelations of thine invisible spirit, summon me to be present, O thou who art my origin and my highest wish.
well, two of the more best-selling and popular religious books are The Power of Now and Be Here Now. And so we see that we have this challenge to be in the moment, and yet it's all we have. The future is an illusion and the past is gone. And we also see that as human beings, we often pursue activities to put us in the now. So, and sometimes they're not healthy pursuits. So you can be an adrenaline junkie, you could shop till you drop, you could want to take drugs or alcohol, trying to stop the monkey chatter of the mind and to be in the now. But we see ultimately that, and certainly when we're in nature, when we feel encompassed by the ocean or by the mountains, it also quiets our mind. So we see that there is this innate desire to be in the now. And we learn that the only way to, in a healthy way, to be in the now is through prayer and meditation and through obedience. So we actually have a passage by Baha'u'llah in which he says, think not that I have revealed a mere code of laws. I have unsealed the choice wine with the fingers of might and power. Now, historically, going back to the god Dionysus, the god of wine in Greece, people drank wine as one of these ways of trying to get in the present, of trying to get drunk. Baha'u'llah is using that metaphor consciously because he's discouraging us from drinking the bottled wine, but yet he's using that metaphor because he's really telling us that it's through obedience to the manifestation of God, to the laws, that we actually become intoxicated and get to live in the present moment. Not through our own various machinations. And so it would seem to me that the use of being in nature, of prayer and meditation, that these are ways of that help me, and I think help many people, of being in the now. And as counterintuitive as it might seem in a society that sometimes erroneously worships individualism, we see that obedience and submission, the word Islam means submission to the will of God, is actually a way of being intoxicated and being in the present. I don't know if that answered that question or not.
Yes, thank you so much.
So I'll ask a question then, if I may.
Go
The
ahead.
quote that I read, Baha'u'llah urges us to greet this day today, the first day of the year, with joy and radiance. So how can we greet this day with joy and radiance?
Do you have any thoughts on how we can do that?
You've heard enough of my thoughts.
Well, people can put their thoughts in the chat, but that's the ultimate question. Someone said, rejoice that we can eat and drink now that the fast is over.
Well, really, it's one of those humbling experiences. We realize, how dependent we get during the fast on silly things. And yet, by the same token, we draw on this other strength that we sometimes, forget we have. I love that passage in the Gospels when Jesus was fasting and he was tempted to turn, the stones into bread. And Jesus said, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Father. And I think that's one of the things we learn during the fast. As much as we enjoy our food and drink, we do tap into another sustenance, and perhaps that's the joy and radiance that we can, just as the Bob is urging us to inhabit space with the attributes of God. Maybe we can create this balance with our physical sustenance, with our spiritual sustenance too.
Definitely, yep. Some other ideas from people are service to mankind, greeting each other with love and unconditional love for humanity.
Mm-hmm. And working for justice as you're doing.
Question from Aaron. Could you please expand on the concept of submission and being in the now?
There's two seemingly contradictory urges and needs in all human beings. One is the desire to be independent, to be free of authority. We see the adolescent trying to break through this way. But the other, interestingly enough, that's reflected in all love and poetry and love songs is this desire to, I'll follow you anywhere, I'll even do wrong for you. This notion of looking for someone to whom you can submit, that you can love. And it's been said by a favorite poet of mine that the only way to fulfill both those needs, excuse me, is by the recognition of the Godhead, because no marriage partner knows you as well as the Godhead. And so the only way you can become your true self and be truly free, and the only freedom really is the freedom to grow. The only way you can be truly free to grow into your highest and truest individual self is through the guidance of the Almighty. And so in submitting then to the will of the Almighty, the way you would to a physician, if you've done your investigation and this is the best doctor in town, and then you get sick and he or she then tells you to take a medicine that tastes lousy, might give you an upset stomach, might keep you awake, you're still going to take it because it's going to help you to grow and to be healthy. And so it's that sense of submission. First, you do the intellectual investigation of truth. There is no such thing as blind faith in the Bahá'í Faith, only conscious knowledge. You do the independent investigation, but once you recognize the divine physician, then you submit, because that's the prescription for living that's going to free you to be your truest self. And so there is no, that false American sort of cowboy individualistic, nobody can tell me what to do, don't tread on me. That was sort of a pendulum swinging too much in one direction, because ultimately we don't even know ourselves well enough, never mind our mate, to tell them what to do. We need to, there's this wonderful, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, but there's this wonderful engraving by the French artist Durer, if I'm pronouncing it right, D-U-R-E-R, of Dante standing next to Beatrice. And together as a perfect couple, they're not looking into each other's eyes, but they're looking towards the beatific vision, the image of the Godhead, because all marriage is that triangular relationship, that it's only through the will of God the relationship becomes perfect. And I like to think sometimes that the Baha'i marriage vow, interestingly, it doesn't say we will both abide by the will of God. It says we will all verily abide by the will of God. There's more than two people involved, and maybe more than two beings, but certainly one thing that has to be involved is the will of God. So it's this notion of standing side by side and then together reflecting the will of God. And so I think that if we have to change some of our cultural prejudices about the word submission and obedience, but of course, the only true obedience, or the only meaningful obedience, is once we have recognized where the source of all good and of all wisdom comes. And that's the quest. That's why we're on earth, to recognize the manifestation of God for the day in which we live.
It's a really good point. Thank you. Lena has kind of a follow-up question to the concept of justice. So she asks, if we're supposed to hold personal definitions of justice that, you know, speaks to our hearts, how could this create order and justice and accountability in this world? For example, some could hold all sorts of reasons why someone murdered someone else, but the facts are facts, and no matter the reasoning or personal injustices, the murderer endured, and so he or she's still a murderer.
Well, we're conflating two things, I believe. When Jesus said turn the other cheek, he was talking about the conduct between two people. He wasn't talking about a court of law. So the conduct between people is one of mercy. It's one of acceptance and one of love and one of forgiveness. The conduct of spiritual assemblies, administration, is one of justice. And so this is the first time in the history of the human race that we have a governing system in which no individual has any power. And that's the Baha'i administrative order. So therefore, we as individuals are freed up from being my brother's keeper. My goal is not to judge you, it's to love you. And it's the goal of the administrative order to do that judging. So in that sense, I think, I'm not responsible for, as an individual, for that enforcement of the law. And so I think that's the distinction we have to make, because I think oftentimes, in fact, Peter Kahn, a former member of the House of Justice, he said oftentimes in the Baha'i world, we see the opposite. We see the individuals practicing justice, judging each other, and sometimes the assemblies being excessively merciful. And he says we have to realize that distinction. And I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it looks like that's it. A big thank you again to Mr. Lysaght. We all really enjoyed that. We learned a lot, and that gave us inspiring words and things to think about today and moving into this new year. So next week, the topic of our talk will be, should religion be hereditary or chosen? A Baha'i perspective. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, so please invite your friends and family. And if you'd like to be on the weekly mailing list, please fill out the contact form that we've put in the chat. And we also put that in the description box of our YouTube videos. Bye, everyone. See you next week.